In our last lecture, we did an overview of deductive arguments. In this one, we're going to do an overview of inductive arguments. An inductive argument is an argument in which the premises, if true, make it probable that the conclusion is true as well. Inductive arguments can have false conclusions, however, even when all the premises are true. But they must support the conclusion in the sense of contributing to or upholding its probability. So the basic idea is, with an inductive argument, the conclusion could be false, but the premises ought to make the conclusion more likely to be true. Inductive arguments lack the definitive and valuable truth-preserving feature of deductive arguments. This apparent shortcoming, however, is more than offset by a feature of inductive arguments that is lacking in deductive arguments. Namely, inductive arguments can extend or amplify our factual knowledge. Remember when we were talking about deductive arguments, we learned that all that's really going on is you're combining information that's already present in the premises to generate the conclusions. With inductive arguments, we can go beyond and extend our factual knowledge beyond what's contained in the premises. For this reason, we call inductive arguments ampliative, because they amplify the amount of knowledge we have. Conclusions of inductive arguments amplify or go beyond the information found in their premises. Conclusions of ampliative arguments contain new information that is not present even implicitly in their premises. While math is a really great example of a deductive system, in almost all other fields of human endeavor, so the natural sciences, the social sciences, history, literary criticism, practical knowledge of human affairs, even ethics, in all these disciplines, inductive inferences and arguments are indispensable. They're the ones that you're going to see most often. There are a number of different kinds of inductive arguments, and we're going to take a look at a few of those now. So, for starters, your book has this example, which is taken from the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume and his book Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. The way this dialogue was set up was different characters were talking. So this is not David Hume in his own voice, it's David Hume in the voice of one of his characters, Philo, but that's not really the point. Let's look at what we've got here. That a stone will fall, that fire will burn, that the earth has solidity, we have observed 1,000 and 1,000 times. And when any new instance of this nature is presented, we draw without hesitation an accustomed inference. Okay, so what's going on is we've got an inference we're drawing about the future based on what's happened in the past. So the inference about the future, that's our conclusion, and what's happened in the past, that's our premise. So what's the info we've got about the past? Well, that when you drop stones, they fall, and that fire burns, and that the earth is solid. Those are the things from the past that we've got. And we've seen this a whole bunch of times. You walk out, you drop a stone, it falls. Pick up another stone, drop it, it falls. Same sort of thing happens over and over. And from this we conclude, well, if I go outside now and drop a stone, what's it going to do? It's probably going to fall. And if I start a fire, what's going to happen? It's going to burn. And yeah, is the earth solid? Yep, it still is. And we don't even think about these inferences. We just make them automatically because we've got so much past experience with the world being this sort of way. So if we wanted to turn this into an argument, it would look something like this. Thousands and thousands of times in the past, dropped stones have always fallen, fires have always burned, and the earth has always remained solid. That's our info about the past. And we conclude from that, if one were to now drop a stone, it would fall. If one were to start a fire, it would burn, and the earth will remain solid. Now, this is a really strong inductive argument. Because this is the way it's always been, we've got excellent reason to think this is the way it would be in the future. But, you could imagine suddenly God decides to change the laws of gravity or something like that. So the next time you drop a stone, it doesn't fall. So it doesn't deductively follow. There are situations we could think of in which this would be true, or this would be false. But there are exceptional situations. Usually, when this is the case, this is going to be the case. So this is a good, strong inductive argument. Okay, we've also got arguments that conclude something about the past on the basis of present evidence. So look at this example from PV Glob. Pollen grains, though microscopic, are preserved in peat bogs in a remarkable manner for hundreds and even thousands of years. Since the pollen of every plant has its own special form, it is possible, with a microscope, to establish what plants were growing at different points in time. The distinct layers in peat bogs thus become, as it were, the pages of a great picture book, illustrating the changing flora of the land through the ages. So we don't actually have any conclusions about the past here, but what Glob is doing is he's talking about a methodology for determining things about the past. You've got these pollen grains, which we can observe now, but they've been there for a long time. And the way in which these grains are arranged, we can make inferences about what happened in the past. And any of those specific inferences, based on this present information, that would be a case of an inductive argument. Arguments that generalize on the basis of a sample of observations or experiments. We'll be talking a lot about this sort of stuff later on in the course, but for now think of examples like the reasoning that occurs in Gallup political polls, or the Nielsen TV ratings, where samples of the population are surveyed and conclusions about the population as a whole are made. So in any individual Gallup poll or Nielsen TV rating poll, a pretty small percentage of the population is actually surveyed. But, and we'll talk about this later, if you get the right kind of sample, you can have a good inductive argument to make a generalization about the population as a whole. But of course, even when the sample's good, there's a certain fallibility, there's a certain chance of error that the information you have about the sample won't appropriately map onto the information you have about the population. Arguments that conclude something about a particular case on the basis of what happens usually or frequently, but not always. So in this example, also taken from your book, we've got sort of a tongue-in-cheek use of this argument by Mark Twain. At bottom, I did not believe I had touched that man. The law of probabilities decreed me guiltless of his blood. For in all my small experience with guns, I had never hit anything I had tried to hit, and I knew I had done my best to hit him. So, of course, this argument is all tongue-in-cheek, and Twain's not being serious here. But the format would be something like this. I didn't hit the man with the bullet that came out of my gun, based on the fact that usually the things I try to hit when I shoot a gun, I don't hit. Okay, this last type we're going to look at, arguments that conclude that a further similarity holds on the basis of known similarities between two types of things. And the argument that your book gives, the example of this kind of argument, comes from Parade magazine, talking about the work of Marion Diamond at Berkeley. Marion C. Diamond, professor of anatomy at the University of California at Berkeley, warned recently that birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain. Dr. Diamond said that research reveals that female sex hormones contained in birth control pills limit growth of the cerebral cortex, a part of the brain which regulates human intelligence. Dr. Diamond has been working with female rats into which she has injected a hormone equivalent to a birth control pill. Such rats showed less growth in the cerebral cortex than rats not injected with the hormone. Okay, so this seems like a good one to kind of break down for what's going on in an inductive argument that you find in a passage like something in a magazine. So let's start by identifying the conclusion. The conclusion is this: birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain. If you're trying to figure out where the conclusion is, a good kind of indicator here is that this is the claim being made by the individual we're talking about. So we're talking about Marion Diamond here, this professor, and her warning is this. The thing that she's warning about is the upshot of what follows. So here we've got our conclusion. Birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain. Now we've got a good deal of information here. What's kind of the immediate piece of information that's grounding this conclusion? Well, it's that research reveals that female sex hormones contained in birth control pills limit growth of the cerebral cortex. So here we've got the claim, birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain, being grounded by the fact that there's research that's done that reveals that female sex hormones contained in birth control pills limit the growth of the cerebral cortex. But we've still got a lot of information here, and the next question you might ask yourself is what grounds this claim, that research reveals that female sex hormones contained in birth control pills limit the growth of the cerebral cortex? Well, that's the fact that rats in these studies showed less growth in the cerebral cortex than rats not injected with the hormone. Female rats, that is. So okay, we've got our conclusion here, grounded by this, further grounded by this. What's going on with all this extra information? Well, things like that Marion C. Diamond is a professor of anatomy at the University of California at Berkeley. This isn't directly part of the argument at all. It's background information that's useful in kind of framing the conversation. Same with the fact that she's been working with these female rats, into which she's injected a hormone equivalent to a birth control pill. This is necessary background to understand what's going on, but really it's the fact that the rats showed less growth in the cerebral cortex than rats not injected with the hormone, given that the fact that the hormone is an equivalent to a birth control pill. And this grounds this, and that in turn grounds this conclusion, that birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain. This might all look a little clearer if we put the argument into standard form. So for starters, we've got the premise that female rats injected with a hormone equivalent to a birth control pill showed less growth in the cerebral cortex than rats not injected with the hormone. Okay, so we've got this piece of information, and from this we conclude that female sex hormones contained in birth control pills limit growth of the cerebral cortex. And from this, it's further concluded that birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain. Now, when we first looked at this argument, we said this was an argument that concludes that a further similarity holds on the basis of known similarities between two types of things. What are the similarities here? The similarity is female rats and female people. This is why we do a lot of animal testing. We assume that there are certain similarities between animals and people. So that's what's going on there. When you're looking at an argument and you're trying to figure out what's going on, there are indicator words for inductive arguments. Just as in deductive arguments, special terms draw attention to the inductive nature of the link between the premises and the conclusion. These terms include probably, usually, may, might, tends to support, likely, very likely, and almost always. All these things have in common that they are making room for error. When you say that something's probably the case, you realize there's an option that it might not be that way. Same with usually, may, might, and all the others. That's why they're indicating inductive arguments, where this chance of error remains. Thus, Dr. Diamond's claim that birth control pills may inhibit development of the brain, this indicates that her argument is likely inductive and not deductive. As we noted in the last video, the way to tell if an argument is deductive is to ask the question, would the premises, if true, make it impossible for the conclusion to be false? If an argument is a deductive argument, the answer to this question will be yes. If the premises are true, the conclusion can't possibly be false. This, of course, is not the case with inductive arguments, because with inductive arguments, the falsity of the conclusion is compatible with the truth of the premises. But the question, would the premises, if true, make it impossible for the conclusion to be false, is still a useful question to ask when trying to identify an inductive argument. In an inductive argument, the falsity of the conclusion is compatible with the truth of the premises, but the premises should make it probable or likely that the conclusion is true. That is to say, the truth of the premises should make the conclusion significantly more likely than it would be otherwise. An important difference between deductive and inductive arguments is that whereas deductive support is an all-or-nothing affair, either the truth of the premises is incompatible with the falsity of the conclusion or not, inductive support may vary in strength. The terms used to indicate that an argument is inductive can provide information about the degree of strength of an argument as well. For example, may, might, and possibly indicate weak or moderate support of the premises for the conclusion, Words like almost always, highly probable, and very likely, they're going to indicate strong support. The expressions with practical certainty or with moral certainty indicate a very high degree of inductive support. This should, though, be kept distinct from full-on certainty, which would be more indicative of a deductive argument. Before closing this lecture, let's look at one more example of an inductive argument found in a passage. This one comes from Gilbert Murray's The Language of Ancient Greece. It is clear that our Iliad, Odyssey, Erga, and Theogony are not the first hexameter poems. These ostensibly primitive poems show a length and complexity of composition which can only be the result of many generations of artistic effort. They speak a language out of all relation to common speech, full of forgotten meanings and echoes of past states of society. A poet's language, demonstrably built up and conditioned at every turn by the needs of the hexameter meter. There must, therefore, have been a hexameter poem before the Iliad. Okay, so let's break this down first by looking for any possible indicator words. What we've got is there, must, therefore. So we've got therefore, which is a conclusion indicator word, and must, which often is going to be an indicator word for a deductive argument, but here it's actually playing a sort of misleading role because Murray kind of overstates the strength of his evidence. It's actually going to turn out that this must is a little too strong, but it's still useful because the must indicates that he thinks he's got good evidence for his conclusion, and that therefore, in fact, picks out the conclusion that there were hexameter poems before the Iliad. So our conclusion is that there were hexameter poems before the Iliad. Let's go ahead and mark that. But something interesting to note is that the first sentence in the passage, it is clear that our Iliad, Odyssey, Erga, and Theogony are not the first hexameter poems. This is just basically a restatement of what he ends with. You may remember in one of the chapters earlier in the book, it was brought up that sometimes conclusions will be restated at both the start and the end of the argument. So that's what we've got going on here. The conclusion that there must be hexameter poems before the Iliad is another way of saying before, this set of poems came about, there were other first hexameter poems. So we've got our conclusions stated in two slightly different ways, but same sort of general force. So okay, if this is our conclusion, and this is basically a restatement of the conclusion, what's going on in between? On what grounds is it being claimed that clearly there were hexameter poems before the Iliad? Well, let's take a look at this sentence. These ostensibly primitive poems show a length and complexity of composition which can only be the result of many generations of artistic effort. So the idea that Murray's going for is, if we look at the complexity and length of poems like the Iliad, we can conclude that there were poems around before, because poems of this complexity wouldn't have been the first the first ones of that type to show up. So the premise is that these poems, due to their length and complexity, had to be the results of many generations of artistic effort, namely artistic effort of the same type of form. And what's grounding this claim? Well, that's what the rest of this is saying. They speak a language out of all relation to common speech, full of forgotten meanings and echoes of past states of society, a poet's language demonstrably built up and considered at every turn by the needs of the hexameter meter. So the idea is, our conclusion is, hey, there had to have been hexameter poems around before the Iliad. On what grounds is this? Well, look at how long and complex the Iliad and these other poems are. That's not going to be the type of thing that happens during a first generation of making hexameter poems. That's going to be the result of lots of generations of refining. Therefore, there have to have been other ones around. So if we want to turn this argument into standard form, it's going to look like this. We've got this first premise. Poems like the Iliad speak a language out of all relation to common speech, full of forgotten meanings and echoes of past states of society.
a poet's language demonstrably built up and conditioned at every turn by the needs of the hexameter meter. Based on this premise, it's concluded that poems like the Iliad show a length and complexity of composition which can only be the result of many generations of artistic effort. And from this, it's further concluded that it is clear that poems like the Iliad are not the first hexameter poems. There must therefore have been hexameter poems before the Iliad. And so we've got our two different ways of stating the conclusion right next to each other as one conclusion. So that's just a little bit of info on inductive arguments. We're going to be spending a lot more time on these in the weeks to come. But for now, we're going to switch over to the last video in Chapter 3, which gives you an overview of fallacies, mistakes in reasonings.